We spent weeks building a whole set of office furniture in the craftsman style of the early 20th century. After all that work, it just didn't seem right to buy door and drawer pulls, so we set out to make our own. I knew I didn't want them just turned on a lathe. I wanted something rectangular, in keeping with the overall style of the furniture itself, and I wanted it from the same white oak. This idea presented three unique challenges. How do we cut the finger hold profile around the edge of the knobs? How do we form a pyramid-like slope on the end? And how do we attach them securely to the doors and drawers? Perhaps as important, though, was how do we do all of this for both wide and narrow pulls, and how do we do it in a repeatable way, because we need a bunch of them. We began with a 3/4 by 3/4 stick of oak, which was cut into individual 1-inch knob blanks. These were taken to the drill press, where a simple notch jig was used to hold them in place in conjunction with the fence to bore the mounting holes. The idea was to do this now before the knobs began to take shape and become harder to hold. Next came a simple jig made from scraps of wood that would hold several of the blanks side by side in a row. The bottom of the jig was open to the router bit, while the top gets covered with a piece of wood to keep all the little pieces from popping out as you pass them over the bit. The profile is formed with a simple core box router bit, which cuts a cove shape. I'll put a link to the one I used in the video description below. It's done in 4 passes, rotating the pieces each time. Now for the pyramid tops. It took some experimentation to find the correct angle, but 2 pieces of plywood were clamped to the sander table, leaving a track for a 3rd piece to slide between them. A notch in the end of the sliding piece holds the knob blank as it's plunged into the abrasive belt. Again, with a little experimentation, you can determine how much you want to sand to form each facet. A stop is then added to the end of the jig to restrict that plunging motion and ensure all 4 facets on the end of each knob come out the same. The key is to not be overly aggressive so you don't overheat the paper and get scorch marks. While it's nice to have a big edge sander for this task, a smaller disc sander or a benchtop belt disc combo would have worked well. That's how we made the first batch of small drawer pulls, but we also needed some wider pulls in the same style for the drawers. Obviously, this presented a different set of challenges, but along the way, we actually learned how to make that first set of small pulls even better. This time, we began with some 3/4 inch thick stock cut to the width of the wide pulls. The stock was routed with the same core box bit, but now it was guided by a miter gauge as the cove was routed all the way around all 4 sides. This formed a single pull on the end of the board, and by flipping the board around, a second pull could be formed on the other end. Another simple sanding jig was made, but this time with the fence rising up perpendicularly from the top of the sander's table. Rather than a depth stop, a pencil mark was added, so when the shoulder line of the cove reached that point, you know the facets formed, and you can stop sanding. Again, this was done through experimentation. This created a peak on the end, and by laying the board flat on the table, you could also chamfer the narrower edges to complete the shape. There's no line to tell you when to stop sanding in this case, but you can easily eyeball the width of the flat facet above the cove profile, and when everything looks even, you know you can stop sanding. As at the router table, you can work on 2 pulls at a time, then trim 1 off each end at the table saw. Note how a stop is attached to the fence to ensure all the pulls are trimmed to the same thickness. Then it's time to bore some mounting holes. These are 3 inches apart, which is the industry standard. A little box is made to hold the pole upside down at the drill press. 1 hole is bored with the jig against the fence, then a spacer block is removed so the jig can be quickly repositioned for the second hole. This makes the process fast and repeatable. To get the blank out, a dowel is inserted in a relief hole on the underside. This worked so well, we thought we would try a similar process for another batch of small pulls. So instead of cutting the sticks into pieces at the start, the cove profiles were routed around each end of a stick using the miter gauge at the router table. Then the same angle jig was used at the sander to form the ends of these small pulls as was used to create the larger ones. The pieces were then trimmed off and bored out at the drill press. This time, a dowel is inserted from beneath through the hole in the drill press table to pop the pull out of the jig. The first jig was a little faster for routing profiles on a bunch of pulls at once, but that required a different sanding jig. I like the second method because it requires 2 fewer jigs overall. Before we wrap up, let's talk about the threaded inserts. If you buy wooden poles from a store, they usually have simple wood threads and special coarse screws. If you're making your own, I think you're better off using inserts inside the holes because regular wood screws won't hold very well in end grain. And I have to admit that end grain gives these poles just the right amount of contrast compared to the door and drawer fronts. It would have been faster and easier to buy some poles, but I think homemade versions are a nice touch, and the process was a lot of fun to figure out. See you next time. The Whiteside family has been making router bits in North Carolina for half a century. Their quality is exceptional, their service is fantastic, and I like supporting small family businesses. That's why my cabinet is full of Whiteside bits, and I think yours should be too. Check them out at the link below this video. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.